Assistant Secretary of State Thomas Countryman. He's going to speak to us today on U.S. policy on global security and non-proliferation. Mr. Countryman is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service. He holds the rank of Minister Counselor and has been the Assistant Secretary for International Security and Non-Proliferation since September 2011, which follows a long and distinguished career with the State Department. The ISN Bureau leads the U.S.'s efforts to prevent the spread of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, their related materials, and their delivery systems. I'm sure you'll hear a lot about this challenging topic today from Assistant Secretary Countryman. Sir?
Well, thanks very much, Dr. Hall, for a kind and a brief introduction, which reinforces the kindness to our audience. Dr. Hall, like a number of other distinguished professors here, could talk about the topic of nuclear security and nuclear non-proliferation better than I can. But let me try anyway to tell you a little bit about the priorities of the U.S. government in terms of confronting threats from weapons of mass destruction and what we're doing about them. First, I always like to mention that I love what I'm doing. I've been working for the State Department as a Foreign Service officer for 32 years now. And two things about the Foreign Service. One, I've never had a boring day on the job, in any country or any office in the United States and overseas. And two, I've never had a bad boss. I've had the honor to work with some of the smartest folks and most decent people around. I would love to talk to any students here from whatever you're studying in the science or public policy or any other field about careers at the State Department, because my career has been a real blessing. I won't dwell on that right now, however. I will be available later. Let me talk instead about the efforts that we are making under the Obama administration, but in great consistency and great follow-up to what every other president has stressed in the field of non-proliferation. It's a particularly timely moment to do it because just a week ago in The Hague, President Obama participated in the third Nuclear Security Summit, a process that he initiated 5 years ago with a historic speech in Prague. In fact, the very first speech that President Obama delivered overseas focused exactly on the question of the nuclear threat that the world faced, and the possibility that even though the threat of an all-out nuclear war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was much smaller than ever, there remained a real possibility that terrorists would seek to acquire enough fissile material to make a nuclear weapon, and that atomic terrorism was a more real threat than an all-out nuclear exchange. So for the third time in The Hague last week, more than 50 leaders from around the world gathered and reaffirmed their commitment to ensuring that nuclear material could not fall into the hands of terrorists or other non-state actors. Last week at the summit, they reviewed the progress that has been made in terms of reducing the number of countries that have any storage of the two materials we're concerned about when we talk about nuclear weapons, highly enriched uranium or plutonium. More than a dozen countries have totally eliminated stockpiles of such materials from their country and removed them to the U.S. or to the Russian Federation. In addition, Japan announced last week that it will work with the United States to remove the last stockpiles, a very substantial stockpile of hundreds of kilograms, back to the United States. And more countries announced very specific measures they would follow in order to improve the security around their nuclear installations. As a consequence, in the last 5 years, we believe that the risk that any of this material could be stolen by terrorists and used in an improvised nuclear device has been very substantially reduced. We haven't finished the task yet, but I think it's an important milestone that just happens to come exactly this month. Let me sketch out, in very general terms, the 4 big challenges we face living in a world where weapons of mass destruction are a realistic threat to the United States and to our friends around the world, and what the State Department has to do to confront each of them. So to tell you right up front, the 4 tasks, the 4 challenges are to combat the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, to deter their use, to prepare to respond to potential use of such weapons, and finally, to reduce the stockpiles of nuclear weapons still held by several countries, including the United States. So on the first, and this is the primary focus of my bureau within the State Department, how do we prevent states that are intent upon building weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons, from going through with it? We faced a very clear challenge in the case lately of especially North Korea, Iran, and Syria in the last several years in their pursuit through clandestine means of nuclear capability. They haven't succeeded entirely, and especially Iran hasn't succeeded entirely because of the dedicated efforts not just of people within the State Department, but across the US government who work together to frustrate all the efforts that Iran or North Korea is making to procure the materials and high technology that go into a nuclear weapons program or a ballistic missile program, or for that matter, chemical or biological weapons. We do that, of course, by cooperation among law enforcement officials, by collecting the best information possible and sharing it with partners around the world, by working to establish clear requirements on strategic trade through the United Nations and through our efforts with allies bilaterally. And of course, we also do it in the bigger sense through strengthening of the most important treaty that we have, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, now more than 40 years old, and one of the most successful international agreements, I think, in diplomatic history. Not perfectly successful in limiting the growth in the number of countries that possess nuclear weapons. We have a few more than we did 40 years ago, but it has proven very successful in deterring many, many more countries from pursuing nuclear weapons. And so we seek to strengthen the importance of the NPT and its implementation by countries around the world. And I can go into further detail on that, but let me pass on quickly to what do you do to deter the use of weapons of mass destruction. There was a conventional wisdom on deterrence that lasted for many years, and that was essentially between the United States and the Soviet Union, that threatening retaliation with the same nuclear weapons was the most effective means to deter the other side from using its nuclear weapons. That's not wrong, that wasn't wrong, but it certainly has evolved, and it certainly needs to evolve in a situation where you're no longer dealing only with the symmetry of two superpowers able to threaten each other in a similar way. Deterrence today requires rather a greater, broader approach. Our nuclear arsenal is still the cornerstone of our defense strategy. That remains true. The President has repeated it several times, saying, as long as nuclear weapons exist, the United States will maintain a safe, secure, and effective arsenal to deter any adversary and to guarantee that defense to our allies. So there still is a sense in which retaliation remains an important part of deterrence. But it's not at all the only aspect of deterrence. We still pursue, or we now pursue, I think, a more variegated strategy to deter either individual countries or terrorist groups from the use of nuclear or chemical or biological weapons. We reinforce our allies. We promote the concept of extended deterrence so that allies have confidence in the United States' ability to defend them. We cast a spotlight on both proliferators and those who are seeking to develop a WMD capability. It is important that those who would be inclined to use WMD against the United States know that they can be identified in advance and after such use. This raises the certainty of detection, greatly raises the cost of use. And I think that we have a partial illustration of this in the case of Syria. Its use of chemical weapons against its own citizens last summer is a demonstration that we were prepared to require the Syrian regime to pay a very heavy price for the use of WMD, not against the United States or its allies, but against its own citizens. The third challenge, preparing to respond to the use of weapons of mass destruction. It can seem kind of a crazy question, and some of our friends around the world in my field, my counterparts from certain nations, think that it's an absurd question to raise. How do you respond to the use of a nuclear weapon? The devastation is so total, there is no conceivable response. Is the argument of a number of friends who are pushing the idea of a legal convention that would make, a global legal convention that would make the possession of nuclear weapons illegal. Obviously, we think that's an idea that would be attractive for many reasons, but is simply 100% impractical. We need to work towards a gradual reduction with the Russians and with other partners to zero, and that is a goal that this president has reaffirmed. But you don't get there simply by a convention that declares all nuclear weapon possession to be illegal. We do need to focus, though, on how we react to the use of weapons of mass destruction, whether they are nuclear, chemical, or biological. And here, of course, this is not entirely a State Department role by any means. Within the United States, entities from the Department of Homeland Security to the Federal Bureau of Investigation to the Department of Defense and many others have specific preparations for how we can respond for varying sizes of emergencies, varying sizes of catastrophes. And I won't speak so much to our domestic preparations. But we do encourage, and here is a role that in particular the State Department seeks to play, to build a similar capacity in other countries through a joint U.S.-Russian initiative that's now been in existence for about 10 years, the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism. We help other countries to develop a national response capability. And that national response capability, of course, includes not only emergency responders, but it includes forensic experts who can determine what has happened and who did it, so that the response and further deterrence can work. We also use that mechanism to deter further the acquisition of such materials. We work with different countries on combating nuclear smuggling so that states, through their normal law enforcement and border capabilities, are able to detect and to apprehend and to seize and secure nuclear material that may be crossing borders. We have, of course, a foreign consequence management team that is based in the State Department, but includes experts from a wide variety of agencies ready to deploy on short notice. And in fact, this team was deployed most recently to Fukushima 3 years ago to help them handle the radiation issue in Japan. And finally, in this very brief sketch of the challenges posed by weapons of mass destruction, there is the challenge of reducing the holdings of nuclear weapons in the world. It has been U.S. policy since signing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in the 60s that we are working towards a world without nuclear weapons. That's a commitment that the United States, Russia, and 3 other countries explicitly undertook in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that we have reaffirmed many times since. Today, the United States and the Russian Federation have the lowest holdings of nuclear weapons in more than 50 years. We have barely 1/6 the number of nuclear weapons today that the United States possessed at the height of the Cold War. We have a mechanism for continuing to reduce between the United States and the Russian Federation, embodied in the New START Treaty, with real means of verification so that each side can have the transparency to see what the other side is really holding. We need to go further, and President Obama has talked, I think, in more detail than recent presidents about how eventually to get to that goal of reducing nuclear weapons holdings down to 0. But it ain't easy. First, it's not my responsibility. I do non-proliferation. There's another bureau within the State Department, Arms Control Verification and Compliance, that has the job of actual negotiating with the Russians and with others. We have a commitment to do this, and we have proposals on the table to the Russians. But at the time, it's difficult to say exactly how we will move forward. Not only because these negotiations between the U.S. and Russia were difficult even before the recent crisis over the Ukraine, but now with that added factor, I'm not sure that the Russian Federation is prepared to move ahead on these bilateral negotiations. And then looking even further into the future, we have what we call a P5 process that includes the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, U.S., Russia, United Kingdom, France, and China, where we are talking about how eventually to construct not just a bilateral arms reduction negotiation, but a multilateral arms reduction negotiation. It is also incredibly difficult, not just in practical terms, but even in theoretical terms, to accomplish them. Still, as I said, it remains our determination to take what steps we can to not only to demonstrate to the world that the United States is keeping its word on the reduction and eventual elimination of nuclear weapons, but because it's the right place to go for our national security, is to move towards that future, no matter how idealistic it may sound to somebody today. Let me stop there. I got a lot more notes, but I always find that I learn more and I help you perhaps a little more by responding to any questions or comments. I'll just list a few of the other things that my Bureau is doing that extend far beyond the realm of nuclear weapons. One is to help not only the United States but the world to design a rational nuclear energy policy, one that incorporates, crucially, the issues of non-proliferation, nuclear security, as Dr. Hall has said, one of the particular areas of expertise here at the University of Tennessee, and nuclear safety as well. So the role of nuclear energy globally. We've been very busy lately in overseeing the removal from Syria of its chemical weapons stockpile, and that's moving ahead. Even in the field of conventional arms, we led the negotiation of a arms trade treaty at the United Nations last year that for the first time set some minimum standards for international trade in arms and ammunition. So you could ask me about those things, about missiles, biological weapons, almost anything else you'd like to, but especially I look forward to hearing some comments from you. And I thank you very much for not only a beautiful day in Knoxville, but for your attention.
Glowing green, but not sure what it's doing. My question is, you talked about like-for-like retaliation in the Cold War days as being the form of deterrence. And at least in my perspective, that has a certain comfort to it in that it's quite predictable. Whether it's bilateral or multilateral, it doesn't matter, it's quite predictable. In the current regime you're speaking about, there's been a shift without, let's say, a formalization of the theory of deterrence. When you're talking about efforts that are primarily ex post, in other words, we'll find out who did it, rather than ex ante, if it happens, we will respond. That creates a whole new set of requirements for military capability and political backbone, political spine, doesn't it?
Well, let's say yes, and then let's say I'm in danger of going way beyond my area of expertise rapidly. But here's what I will say, that when in the Cold War, the particular threat was viewed only as the possibility of an overwhelming nuclear strike by the Soviet Union against the United States, it was fairly easy to be simple. The response is immediate, it's preordained, it will be executed, massive retaliation. I think what successive leaders in Moscow and Washington have accomplished is to greatly reduce the risk and the concern of such an all-out nuclear strike. They haven't reduced it to zero, and certainly there are those in the Kremlin, in the security establishment, who worry a lot more about the threat of a unilateral U.S. strike on Russia, I think, than that we worry about the threat of a surprise attack by Russia on the United States. The idea of massive retaliation is not absolutely dead by any means from that particular scenario. But what we have come to recognize, because of the important progress made, because of changes to our nuclear posture, both those that we've negotiated with the Russians and those that we've undertaken unilaterally and as announced last year by the administration, by taking a number of assets off the hair trigger, we've brought that risk down very greatly on both sides. What we do have to think about, and in almost every situation, you have some time to think about it. What happens if as we saw in the case of Syria, WMD chemical weapons are used on a large scale against a civilian population. In other scenarios, what are the options for deterrence or retaliation on things that are much smaller in scale? A dirty bomb, a radiological dispersion device detonated in the U.S. or somewhere Syria, or against U.S. interests overseas. You have other options other than retaliation in kind to use for deterrence and response in cases other than the one that dominated our thinking for 60 years, an exchange between the U.S. and Russia. Sir?
Yes, sir, thank you. You made the comment that nuclear detonation would be devastating. That doesn't sound true. We dropped 2 on Japan. We had buku atmospheric tests. Nothing devastating happened. What's so devastating about exploding nuclear weapons on a limited basis?
Yeah. No, it's a very good question, and it's exactly at the heart of the discussion that I referred to. Before I come right to that question, let me set kind of the bureaucratic diplomatic setting that we're dealing with right now. Within the Non-Proliferation Treaty, again, as I said, this is one of the most successful treaties in the history of the world. And it contained 3 ideas, 3 mutually reinforcing pillars. It said that everyone who doesn't have nuclear weapons agrees that they won't pursue them. The 5 states that do have nuclear weapons agree to work towards their elimination. And every state, every country, has the right to enjoy the benefits of nuclear technology, including nuclear power. Those 3 pillars remain valid, and President Obama reaffirmed them as the basis of the U.S. approach in his 2009 speech. Now, a number of our friends around the world are dissatisfied with the pace of nuclear reductions, of nuclear disarmament. They see that the 5 nuclear weapon states, 40 years after the signing of the treaty, have not yet reached 0. And they believe that the process is moving very slowly. We have a very different point of view. We see that in the last few years, with the implementation of the New START treaty, U.S. and Russia have continued dramatically to reduce their holdings. But those states that are dissatisfied with this pace, which see the U.S. and the Russians, not to mention the Chinese, British, French, as dragging their feet on reduction of nuclear weapons, a number of those states are pushing for a faster alternative. That is by discussing what they call the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, that they could lead to an international conference that would adopt a legal instrument that would declare illegal any possession of nuclear weapons. That's the path they're pursuing. And the exact question you asked is one of the questions in this debate. A number of advocates of this approach make the very simplistic argument that any detonation of any nuclear weapon is so catastrophic, so disastrous, that the only thing you could do about it is to ban nuclear weapons. Now, it puts those of us who disagree in the awkward position of either saying, one nuclear weapon's not so bad. We're not going to say that. We're not going to get drawn into that game. The use of any one atomic weapon, whether it's by a state or by a terrorist, is obviously disastrous, catastrophic. You pick the word. But we absolutely disagree with those who say any single weapon is so disastrous that the only thing you can do is ban it. That's an irresponsible position for a government. You need to be able to respond in terms of first response for survivors, limiting further damage, limiting damage to infrastructure, by being prepared, helping to deter such use of weapons. We think that the debate is far more complex than simply saying any single use is so terrible that you must ban all of them immediately. So I think I'm agreeing with the point that you made. And I wouldn't want you to get hung up over whether the use of a single weapon is bad or disastrous or catastrophic or Armageddon-like. I don't wish to be pinned down there. But I think the point you're making is exactly the point where the U.S. disagrees with a number of countries that are pushing this argument. So you want to follow up, maybe?
If we got all nuclear weapons removed, if we got all nuclear weapons done away with, doesn't this play into the hands of the countries with the big armies and the advanced weapon systems? I mean, even back in World War II, we wiped out Dresden, killed 40,000. This is 2014. Doesn't that play into our hands and the Russians and the Chinese?
You can make that argument. I don't think it's an argument you need to make today.
Conventional weapons are so efficient and so deadly. We've got monstrous conventional weapons.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm not going to either agree or disagree with you. I'm just going to say that we are not going to be moving next year or the year after to the elimination of nuclear weapons. Those are all issues that will have to eventually be discussed as we get into still more serious reductions. But when we haven't even moved yet from the phase of bilateral U.S.-Russian negotiations to multilateral negotiations involving other nuclear weapon states, those are good things to think about, but they don't need to be decided today. Yes?
Kind of a follow along to your remarks on those two questions. From the initial question, you in your initial remarks and in your answer mentioned the balance between the U.S. and Russia. Does the conventional deterrence model still hold sway for smaller states like North Korea and potentially Iran? Does conventional deterrence and the deterrence, is that still the primary policy for response? And then the second point to the other gentleman's question, particularly on your response to him, maybe you can do this way, I don't know. Is flexible response, you mentioned we're not going to get rid of all of our weapons and we still have to have the ability to respond. Is flexible response still a dominant policy as well, particularly if their weapons are used, and to what degree is flexible response, not an all-out retaliation, but perhaps as you said earlier, in time, what sort of levels of response are we looking at?
Well, I think the second question, it's a great thing to think about. I think it's too nebulous for me to answer in that, as I said, there was one circumstance in which the response was preordained, hardwired. All-out nuclear attack on the U.S. gets an all-out nuclear response on the Soviet Union. Almost anything other than that, and I'm not a military strategist, so I'm careful to avoid using specific words. Almost anything other than that, I don't know if that's what you mean by flexible response. That anything other than that hardwired instantaneous reaction, you stop and think about. And I would hope that future political, military, diplomatic leaders have very few automatic responses and many more cases where they stop and think what exactly is the correct response in this area. Now, you asked that second part as kind of a general question. On the first part, Korea and Iran. And what United States policy is here. First, the most important thing that we've done is to reassure allies who are most directly threatened, either by North Korea, that would be South Korea and Japan, or by Iran, and that would be a number of the Gulf Arab states as well as Israel, to reassure them of our commitment to their security according to terms that we've long held with them. Second is to work on the diplomatic initiatives that would, in the case of Iran, prevent it from succeeding in an attempt to develop nuclear weapons. And in the case of North Korea, roll back their nuclear weapons potential, which they've demonstrated, to the level at which they promised to roll it back 10 years ago. A harder task than in the case of Iran, because they've already moved ahead into the testing stage. Neither one of them, I would say, is yet in a situation where they have an instantaneous capability. Certainly Iran is not, and North Korea we do not believe has the capability to deliver a nuclear warhead to the continental United States. So I don't think in either of those cases you need to think about what is our hardwired, preordained response to a circumstance that really can't happen yet. I don't know if that's helpful to you. That our work has to be in reassuring allies and in using all diplomatic means, and of course diplomatic means include the use or threat of military, using all diplomatic means to prevent any further development of those programs.
So my question's a little different tangent. Explosions are used for non-military purposes as well, in mining and so forth. In 1968, my employer had hoped to become the chosen contractor to build a new Panama Canal across Nicaragua. Would have been a Nicaragua canal. And they were going to do it with a chain of nuclear explosions, joined the craters. That's actually fairly commonly done on a small scale with ordinary explosives.
Yeah.
So that didn't happen, but the upcoming potentially controversial use, non-military use of explosives would be in the field of asteroids. If we were confronted with a significant asteroid impact, one of the weapons that people would like to use or have in their choice is a nuclear explosion. And I just wonder if the current state of treaties and so forth will permit anything of the non-military use.
Okay. I think it was a good thing that nobody used nuclear weapons to dig canals. Excuse me, nuclear explosions, not nuclear. There were some brilliant ideas that came out of the collapse of the Soviet Union 20 years ago, in which, with a lot of surplus warheads, there were generals who had just become entrepreneurs who had some really great ideas for disposing of hazardous materials with controlled nuclear explosions underground. Those are ideas that may be technically brilliant, but are politically just dumb. And I don't see a potential for peaceful nuclear explosions on Earth, to be honest. In terms of asteroids, I don't think anybody's going to be opposed to the use of nuclear weapons against asteroids that are coming towards the Earth. Again, if we reach, in a generation or two, agreement on reducing nuclear stockpiles down to zero, that will have to be addressed, and I'm not going to predict today how it will be addressed, but it's a legitimate question. Sir?
I
I do appreciate what you're doing. I really, I mean that sincerely. I know many of us wonder how things are going in the world at times and wonder how decisions are made with the complexity of bureaucracies. And I'm sure your work seems nebulous at times, but I appreciate it.
Thank you.
There are a lot of people who are working toward peaceful agreements on all kinds of things, and one in particular is the LV group. Are you familiar with that group?
No.
They're Russian and American generals. Some American general decided that this was important to looking at the nuclear issues and terrorism in particular. Felt that American and Russian generals, since we had much to do with all of this, should meet. And so naming themselves after the Elbe River, where the Russians grew up on one side and we grew up on the other in World War II. They're meeting twice a year now. And yeah, I want you to know about that because I'm wondering how a group of people meeting like this to come out with written documents and recommendations, and how does a group with that kind of, I would see it, authority, power, how are they going to influence the whole array of complexities that which you already alluded to several things?
Okay, great question. In general, there has been a very rapid expansion of what we call track 1.5 or track 2 dialogues. The idea of calling things track 1.5 or track 2. When governments negotiate face-to-face officially, we call that a track 1 discussion. When you've got countries that need to talk to each other, but have a lot of obstacles to doing so, like Israelis and Palestinians at many times in their history, you try to organize a track 2 dialogue where non-government figures get together and privately try to discuss things. And of course, now there's been all variations on this. Track 1.5, bring together government and non-government experts from a couple of countries in the same room and have them talk about issues. These industries, these efforts are growing even faster than the government itself is growing in these areas. And they're extraordinarily valuable. They have proven to be the means by which gradually we build up a relationship in a specific area with a country that has some innate distrust of the United States. So just to take one example, Myanmar or Burma is in the process of rapid transition from a military dictatorship towards a democratic state. They're not all the way there yet, but we're building up a relationship in one field after another. And in order to help build up a relationship in this field of non-proliferation, we did one of these 1.5 dialogues that brought together generals and government officials and some academics from Burma with counterparts from the US and the United Kingdom, and just put them in a room and talked about nuclear issues and other biological and chemical issues. Anyway, all of that to say these are enormously valuable, and although I hadn't heard specifically of the LV group, it's exactly the kind of thing that could make a contribution. How you feed the contribution into the Russian side, I don't know very much about. It could be that I'm blinded by where I sit, but I do believe that there is a full appreciation in the United States, not just in the White House or the State Department, but also in the Pentagon, of how crucial it is to be able to cooperate with Russia, and for that matter with China, on nuclear issues of all kinds and on prevention of terrorism. I don't think that there's any doubt about that. I think in Moscow, it's not quite the same. I think there is a far deeper level of suspicion within the military and what they call the deep security state about what the U.S. is up to when it discusses these topics. That is a real problem that we have to contend with. And I don't know how to make a dent in the influence that the deep security state has over the mind of the president and vice versa. Sorry.
Okay.
Long not answer, but if you wanted to follow.
We have time for 3 more questions, and they're already in the queue, so I'm going to start with this gentleman right
Thanks.
I'd appreciate your comments about accidental detonation by clandestine but rogue governments in light of conspiracy theory, global media, and disinformation dissemination.
But accidental detonation? Sorry, but another government accidentally detonating or intentionally detonating and saying, whoops.
Accidentally by a terrorist group trying to develop it that doesn't have the expertise.
Okay. Gee, I don't know what to say. There are, how great is the risk of an accidental detonation? Of somebody trying to improvise a fission device. I bet you have guys here who can calculate the odds of doing that. I think what we've been trying to do, and I'm very grateful that President Obama put the focus on this in his very first foreign policy initiative, is to take an event, the probability of which had been gradually increasing, that is terrorist acquisition of special nuclear material or improvising nuclear devices. The probability of that happening had been steadily increasing. And he said we can take decisive steps to gradually, or rapidly rather, reduce the probability of that happening. And that's what we've done worldwide in the last 5 years. So that the probability of any terrorist organization getting their hands on enough plutonium or highly enriched uranium to construct a device has been steadily decreasing. We haven't gotten to 0. And we know that there are people crazy enough to try to acquire such highly enriched uranium. So that's one aspect, is terrorism. Aspect of state arsenals. There are a lot of people who have been concerned about the fact that India and Pakistan possess significant numbers of nuclear weapons, and that there are security challenges internal to both those countries, whether terrorism or outside sources. They have security issues they have to deal with. We've made it clear directly to both Pakistan and India that they have a huge responsibility to focus on the security of those weapons. And both countries have made it clear to us that they take that responsibility seriously and are dedicated to preventing any diversion of those weapons by any terrorist group, and that they have measures in place to prevent that. So on that score, you can never say we're 100% satisfied. It should be something you worry about when you have the intersection of weapons in a country in which there are real security problems. But we are deeply impressed by the measures both Pakistan and India have taken to address that particular risk. So, yes, sir.
Thank you for your comments. They've been very insightful. I added one question. The concept of nuclear weapons has a negative stigma that seems to carry over to nuclear energy. And so my question is, what role does the state want to play as far as building a new sustainable and clean energy cycle with an emphasis on nuclear energy, excuse me. What role does the State Department play in that whole concept as we move forward?
Yeah. Well, again, there are a lot of actors in this particular field. There's the question of designing a U.S. energy strategy, and in that, we're not very significant players. But in terms of both conveying U.S. priorities to other nations and helping other nations to meet standards of nuclear development that are non-proliferant, safe, and secure, we have intense cooperation programs with a number of countries around the world. And in particular, a lot of that cooperation on a technical level is actually carried out by the University of Tennessee Institute for Nuclear Security, by Oak Ridge National Laboratories, by other partners among the Department of Energy national labs and universities in the U.S. It's not so much that we travel out there directly. The challenge right now is different than it was 4 years ago. 4 years ago, there was greater optimism about the future potential of nuclear energy to solve the world's energy demand problems in a carbon neutral way. And President Obama clearly outlined the need for the United States to have an all-of-the-above approach to energy issues, that we need to have carbon neutral energy sources, but we can't entirely ignore the fact that carbon emitting sources remain important, and we can't ignore the need to reduce consumption to improve efficiency. And in that context, nuclear energy has a role both in the U.S. and worldwide. And that remains our position. But in the meantime, of course, Fukushima happened. Global demand for nuclear energy has dropped significantly. There has been, as a result, not quite a moratorium, but a de facto slowdown, freezing of new power plants. And in that situation, it has become, I think, a little more important that for those countries, whether they paused in their pursuit of nuclear energy and are now ready to pursue it again, it's become even more important that we work with them to demonstrate how you could pursue nuclear power production in a way that does not increase proliferation risk, in a way that is safe, that can avoid a Fukushima or any other kind of accident, and that is secure, that is resistant to any attempt to divert special nuclear materials, nuclear fuel, or output from the plant. And a number of countries that are prepared to move ahead have thought very deeply about how to integrate all those requirements. Others that talk about nuclear power, I think, are just at the beginning of figuring out how to integrate all of those. And this is extremely important work in education that's done right here more than it's done through the State Department. Sorry, long answer, but that's the end. Thanks.
Thank you for your time, sir. My question is, does the State Department regulate the nuclear and chemical arms manufacturing industry? Has the production been stopped or absorbed by the military or other federal departments?
Okay, well, chemical and nuclear are two very different things. The United States signed and ratified the Chemical Weapons Convention, 20 years ago, I think. And that required the United States to destroy all of its chemical weapons holdings from the Cold War. Well, our holdings were massive. And although we've been working on it steadily for 20 years, we have not yet finished destroying all the chemical weapons that the United States produced. And we've had an extension from the other members of the treaty so that we can complete that process. But the United States does not manufacture chemical weapons. We have no manufacturing capability for that anymore. And we should complete within the next couple of years the destruction of all the chemical weapons we once had. Nuclear is very different. It's not managed by the Department of State. We're not building new nuclear weapons, but in very short description, what we are doing is stockpile reliability, that is maintaining an assurance that those nuclear weapons that we still hold are safe and are reliable. But this is work managed by the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense rather than by the Department of State.
Well, unfortunately, we have a very tight schedule for the Assistant Secretary, so we're going to have to close the floor to questions. Let's thank the Assistant Secretary again. And thank you all for coming here to this event.